Okay, we're keeping the train rolling with these video game vlogs. I think this is going to be the last one for a while. I think I'm going to get it out of my system. This one will be, I know sometimes people ask about info on the old school kind of Street Fighter scene and how maybe I got into Street Fighter, how I got into it. Let's about, I know I've done videos about some of my experiences in the video game community, but how did I get into, say, Street Fighter per se? And of course, I know this is one of those things. I know I probably look younger than I am now because that's I keep myself very healthy because after all the dying stuff. But I probably look younger than I am now, but when I was younger, I looked older than I was because of all the health stuff. So I do actually remember arcades, even though probably people might not always look like that depending on how sick I am. But so Street Fighter, how did I get into Street Fighter? And I'll talk about some of the old school games. Well, I'm old enough to remember reading about guys like Mike Watson, Tomo, and all those kind of guys, and all the magazines as a kid, right? And young enough, I couldn't even pop a boner yet when I was reading about those guys. So I've said before too, I didn't really have a great childhood per se. So one of the only good memories, and I even told my grandma this recently, and it looks like she's gonna die soon, but that's another story. One of the only good memories I had as a kid was actually going to the arcade, and sometimes my grandma would take me. And of course, I had been to the arcade every now and then. You might see an arcade, and they take you. But one of the only good memories I've had from as a child that I even still remember is actually when I would go to the arcade. And I remember sometimes my grandma might be like, "Okay, I'll take you to the arcade for a few hours, but we have to go to the flower store first or something." Stupid like that, right? I don't want to go see the flower store, but whatever. We did it for grandma, right? So real young, right? So I was playing video games, way back during the Street Fighter 2 days, reading about people like Mike Watson, Tomo, all these kind of guys, and then eventually getting to meet them was definitely a crazy thing. Even though, I didn't play video games and tournaments for very long because I quit really soon. I only kept entering for a while because I was able to win. But I guess it was kind of cool to meet those guys for the little bit that I did enter tournaments. But so what would happen is, and this isn't like I was like poor or anything, right? But I've always said this before that I definitely play video games. I'm a nerd. I'm jacked off to tons of hentai, video games, whatever, right? But I've never been one of those people that plays Street Fighter all day or Guilty Gear or Guilty Gear or any of these other fighting games. Some people say they play eight video games 8 hours a day. That's not me, right? If I was going to do that, I'd rather play an RPG. But so I didn't even have like Street Fighter for a long time, right? So I remember, especially like during the summer or something like that, a lot of times, like, so we might go to my grandma's house, you know what I mean, for the week or the weekend or whatever. And so a lot of times I would get to play like Street Fighter just during like breaks of school as a kid. We'd go to grandma's and my grandma would take me to the arcade. And that's how I learned about things like Street Fighter, and that's how I eventually started playing, back during Street Fighter 2 and everything like that. And of course, I couldn't drive, so I had to go to the arcades that were like near me. And back when I was younger, there used to be this arcade called Tilt. I don't know if it's around anymore, but Tilt was a huge arcade that was like not like it. It literally was. It was 2 stories. It was a 2-story arcade. It was fucking crazy. And back then, you know what I mean? And the whole bottom floor was only fighting games, right? And I'll try to tell some like fighting game stories too, but that was really cool, right? All fighting games down there, and so I got to play like a lot of like the older guys would teach me how to play, and they kind of like took me under their wing. And God, they very well could have been going to tournaments back then, but I didn't know regular people could go to tournaments back then. But I remember they had told me that they would like travel around to places and stuff like that to other arcades around, the Midwest and play people. And they used to teach me. I remember them teaching me how to do like the guile handcuff glitch and all that kind of stuff like that. And that's where it's like one of those things. So God, who knows how fucking old I was? I was fucking elementary, hella young, right? I was super young. Who knows how young I was? But So they were the ones that I learned how to play Street Fighter from them. And back in that arcade, to not get into like too much stuff, back in my area, and of course there's other arcades, other places, but I couldn't drive, of course. It's just wherever my grandma would take me. Back when we played, the most popular games really were Street Fighter 2, Championship Edition, and Hyper Fighting, right? Those were the most popular games, right? At the time, other fighting games were kind of like every now and then you might find a place that has like, the SNK games, like Neo Geo games. They were kind of like novelty-ish, and not every place had them. And when they did have them, everyone really just played Street Fighter 2 and Championship Edition. If people want to talk about, some people they want stories about games like or the hacks like what are they called, like Rainbow Edition, those kind of stuff. In my area, I don't know exactly what edition is considered Rainbow Edition, right? When I was younger, we used to just know that certain times you would go to arcades because we would talk about it, which sounds so weird. Basically, some little elementary kid talking to like other high school dudes, or they probably were even in college, right? If they said they were traveling randomly to arcades across America, right? But we would talk about like, man, have you ever played this one Street Fighter where, because there used to be this one version of the game that was not super crazy, but when you would shoot a fireball with Ryu or Guile, you could just kind of hold up on the stick and the fireball would go up or down. But in general, the game was actually not super crazy. So it seemed like a ghetto championship edition for some reason like that, right? I mean, certainly, there were crazy ones. Like I remember there was this one where fucking Blanca, whenever you did electricity, you shut out sonic booms, and then there's Hurricane Gate, and there was ones where you could do fireballs in there, all this kind of crap, right? But usually what we talked about in the arcade was every now and then you'd find an arcade that would have a sort of just ghetto championship edition that wasn't like correct or something like that, right? But those are my stories about things when people talk about Rainbow Edition and that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, so yeah, regular Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition and Hyper Fighting were all really popular back then, and I remember, yeah, those guys they would teach me how to play. I know a lot of people say that Super kind of killed Street Fighter, and I will say that a lot of arcades didn't actually have Super. Like in my area, like any arcades around us that had Super, Super was like the only thing there. So if you wanted to play Super, you would have had to go to this arcade. And most people were just fine playing, Championship Edition or Hyper Fighting, right? So people didn't really play Super too much. Um, for Super Turbo was another game that was hard to find because it wasn't widely available. Like even Super, like the only time you could find a Super arcade where I was when they had the big Super used to have this big. It was like the tournament edition. I think one arcade had that, right? So, when people talk about what game killed Street Fighter, some people talk maybe that it was Super, right? So that's hard to say because no one wanted to go to the arcade anyway, because the arcade that had Super was like lame. And so everyone was just like wanted to play Hyper Fighting and Championship Edition, right? So I can't say that Super killed Street Fighter. Whatever. Super Turbo was another game that not a lot of arcades around us had it. So again, a lot of people we just chose to play, you know, Hyper Fighting and Championship Edition. For some people, I know some people like there's like mystiques and stuff about this, like how people played, a lot of these old games. I will say that comparatively, I feel like obviously when we were younger, things like people again, no one talks like frame data or anything like that, right? People didn't talk like that, but there were certain things like nowadays that didn't exist would be like no one talked about safe jumps or anything crap like that, you know what I mean? No one used words like safe jump or option select or option select or anything like that when we're talking about kind of like skill in games, right? But what you did have back then that I don't think is generally as good now is a lot of just like fundamental basics were better back then. like the way that people, you use proximity blocking and certain kinds of footsies and, knowing the ranges of moves and everything like that. Certain things like that were more commonplace the way the games were like played. More, again, kind of like fundamental knowledge. Like, say, not like option, because people didn't talk about option selects or anything like that back then. You know what I mean? Like, certainly some things like are more advanced now, but other things were more advanced back then. Were regular, right? I mean, I hopefully you get what I'm saying. Going off on a tangent. Yeah, so certain fundamental stuff was like better back then, but other things I know some people that came off like throughout the years. God, I remember. Okay, so say something like Ryu's unblockable hurricane kick, right? And Super Turbo. Now we know that's unblockable for years and years now. But like back in the day, it was just kind of something like because you would do like cross up hurricane kicks sometimes, and like regular mix ups like that, and it just kind of felt like, man, is it just like randomly crossing me up when it shouldn't from this like position, right? So certain knowledge like that wasn't known back then. And this is just talking about my own world, right? Maybe it was different, but certainly I'd never seen it talked about like in Game Pro or anything like that. But or any like common knowledge that we had in our arcades that the older guys would teach me. But it was just kind of like, man, this is just really hard to block sometimes. Like, or you know what I mean? Like, I guess it crossed me up for some reason. Or certain things like, God, I remember back when I first found out about sites like SRK and stuff, and people were calling, say, like, they would call like a tiger knee hurricane kick, like the juice kick or the rainbow hurricane kick. And I remember like people were like, oh, we've never heard about this before, but I can tell you as a kid, like that's just called like a tiger knee hurricane kick. You know what I mean? So even the back years and years ago when I first found out about SRK, even that long ago, certain things that people thought were new, just years and years, I guess, a little bit after arcades, were not actually new. Do you know what I mean? So you got to kind of pick and choose. Certain things are more advanced now, but certain things are not as advanced. Hopefully, you get what I'm trying to say. Um, Other stories about old arcades. Were any other games popular? I mean, okay, so after Super Turbo, a lot of people say that Street Fighter Alpha killed Street Fighter 2. So it's like Super killed Street Fighter 2. Then it tried to make a comeback with Super Turbo. And then Street Fighter Alpha killed Street Fighter. Well, I can tell you, excuse me, where I lived, Street Fighter Alpha, the original one, was very popular. Street Fighter Alpha brought a lot of people back to the arcade to play. I remember there was lines to play Street Fighter Alpha. Like it was not that, and here's the thing. Street Fighter Alpha, the very first one, is a like misunderstood game, right? Like, don't get me wrong, Street Fighter Alpha has a lot of problems, right? Like, it's a bit clusterfucky. Again, okay, so a lot of people complain about Street Fighter Alpha that are not actually good at it, right? And again, if anyone can watch me and the Japanese when we used to play that, and people started knowing me for Street Fighter Alpha, the first one, I guess, right? When way back in the day, I guess when that happened. But a lot of things that people complain about Street Fighter Alpha that is the bad thing about it is like not necessarily the bad thing about it. Like say people say that guy redizzies you and you automatically die. Well, that's not how the fucking game works. Yes, like guy had a redizzy combo, which doesn't even work in every version of the game anyway, which is so it's already fucking misleading. But this is like kind of like stories that you hear people tell legends, and the legend isn't true. Like, oh, guy hits you once and you automatically die. Well, that's not really how the game worked. You know what I mean? It's not like guy just hits you with anything and you get dizzy and then he redizzies you. So it's like more like, well, if guy actually were to hit you with this dizzy combo, actually because you can get out of dizzy so fast in that game, and because guy's jump is so slow, it's not very realistic for him to actually do I hit you once, then I redizzy you and you die, right? That's just not how the game works. Can he redizzy? Yes. Like the cheap thing about Guy is more so that his overhead just does so much stun. It's like the simple thing. Like his overhead does so much damage and it does so much dizzy for what it is. And then you kind of add in the clusterfuck of the game and that you can roll everything. So there gets kind of like a mix up of a clusterfuck of like you can roll everything, but you got to remember in that game, every character can punish rolls so fucking hard. Not just Guy, right? I mean, I've showed before, like Ryu sweeps you, and if you roll the sweep, he can fucking kill you, right? This is just not how the game it's like a legend how some people say like that just guy could do that. So like I would always compare it to Akuma and Ken are the best guys in the game actually. And again, if anyone's ever watched me play the Japanese, you would see how good Akuma and Ken are, right? Like Shotos are very strong. Ryu is very fucking strong in that game. You know what I mean? Ryu has that fucking unblockable cross up to like dizzy combo. That's another thing. A lot of people think that the chain combos were necessarily broken. A lot of the best combos in the game are not necessarily a chain combo per se, right? It's not just, at least not if your chain combo you're thinking A, B, C. Those aren't, that's not necessarily the best combo in the game, right? And even I can tell you, like I said, I have never, even back in the day in the arcade, and even when I played the Japanese, I have never once been hit by a guy automatically killing me with the dizzy combo and then redizzy me. It's just not how the game works. Hell, I've never done it before. I've done lots of dizzy combos, but whatever the case, that's just not how the game works. Okay, so again, maybe if you played some very first version of the game where they talked about in magazines where Charlie could like cancel all his moves and everything like that, but I've never even played that one in arcade. You know, that's Charlie can't cancel his moves like that, and once you actually play the game, um, maybe there's some Japanese version of it that people have played, but I don't know. Um, Yeah, so Alpha was actually really popular, actually, and again, it has a lot of problems. It's a bit of a clusterfuck of a game, and we're not going to go about all the problems of it, but it was still fun, and it still had, you know what, Dragon Punches were still Dragon Punches. Dragon Punches still beat everything, you know what I mean? Certain fundamentals were still there. There's the clusterfucking problem with rolling, and a lot of moves just seem too powerful for what they are, but some fundamental aspects of Street Fighter was still there, kind of, you know what I mean? And then when Alpha 2 came, I can say, dude, Alpha 2, okay, no, I know a lot of people like Alpha 2, but no one played Alpha 2 where we were. Alpha 2 fucking just nobody liked Alpha 2 when I was playing. And you could say that, okay, you say maybe that's just a byproduct of it's actually your argument might be Clayton. Actually, people didn't like Alpha and Alpha killed it so bad. That's why people didn't play Street Fighter Alpha 2. But maybe that's true. But I can tell you when we were in the arcade, people would still play Street Fighter Alpha. But once Street Fighter Alpha 2 came out, no one wanted to play Street Fighter Alpha 2, dude. I mean, people were just like, they didn't want to play with the custom combos and, DPs were starting to get beat by things and everything like that. And don't get me wrong, like, there's still some, like, on some fundamental level, it's more, fundamental maybe in some aspects of than Street Fighter Alpha, but it was also taking away some aspects of Street Fighter Alpha because then you had to, or like just Street Fighter Jump because DPs were losing, and then you traded like these big rolls that was a very 50-50 clusterfuck mind game of do I roll this to not be comboed or be set up, or do I roll into a dizzy combo from most of the good characters in the game basically. They just would fucking demolish a roll. Um, but then they added little punch rolls, which were, whatever. So a lot of people didn't play Alpha 2. I remember people getting mad that Rolento's moves hit so much and just, and my argument for this is, and I know a lot of people won't agree with this, but for Street Fighter Alpha 2, Street Fighter Alpha 2 was a cooler game than Street Fighter Alpha. How about this? But I would actually say if you actually put all the characters that were in Street Fighter Alpha 2 in Street Fighter Alpha, and you put all the backgrounds in Street Fighter Alpha 2 that were in Street Fighter Alpha, because Street Fighter Alpha didn't have enough characters, it didn't have enough backgrounds, you know what I mean? It has better music, whatever, and you just had the system of Street Fighter Alpha. I know this. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I actually think people would have liked Street Fighter Alpha more than Street Fighter Alpha 2 now. I think people not everyone's gonna believe that, but people didn't like how powerful alpha counters were. Custom combos, the little punch roll, DP started losing. Yes, there were no more chain combos, but you know, no one played Street Fighter Alpha 2. And as a matter of fact, no one played Street Fighter Alpha 2 so much. I can tell you, I thought that Street Fighter Alpha, or I thought that Street Fighter almost died. Because I remember going to the tilt and man, they started Street Fighter Alpha 2 did so badly that man, they started making they put all the games to like 3/4 instead of 2/4. And some games did come out around that time, like Street Fighter 3 came out, but No one wanted to play Street Fighter 3. It's like everyone, all the dudes there, is like, dude, we can just play Championship and Hyper Fighting still. And if we want a wacky game, we can play Street Fighter Alpha. We don't want to play Street Fighter 3 because Street Fighter 3, it's 3/4 as well. And then Street Fighter EX came out. It's like, it's kind of different, but we don't want to play 3/4 for Street Fighter EX when we can, again, we can play Hyper Fighting or Championship Edition for 2/4. And if we want to play something a little bit weird, we could just play Alpha. That's what it was like at the arcade that I was going to, right? And I remember Alpha 2, seeing Alpha 2 at other arcades, and nobody wanted to play it. We would just play Street Fighter, right? So Street Fighter 3 was just, it just died in arcades too. But, and I remember I didn't even know that there was a Street Fighter Alpha 3, right? Because, again, this is getting into, a lot of people think that because of what I've done in video games, I was playing fighting games a lot, but I didn't really have a lot of fighting games, right? A lot of times when I would play people, I would have to go to arcades, and I couldn't go to the arcades all the time because someone would have to drive me because I was so young. So, people thought I've ever played video games 8 hours a day, fighting game, But um, so I remember when Street Fighter Alpha 3 came out, I didn't even know that there was a Street Fighter Alpha 3. I just saw it in a magazine. Like, I thought Street Fighter had died so badly. I didn't even know there was a Street Fighter Alpha 3. And if you want my opinion on Street Fighter Alpha 3, Street Fighter Alpha 3 is another game like, wow, Street Fighter Alpha 3, when you first played it, it's like, wow, this game is like really cool and really different, but it's kind of weird, right? Like, it was like one of those, like, man, this game is kind of cool and kind of different, but it's kind of weird too. Do you know what I mean? It's getting kind of weird. So I remember not a lot of people played Street Fighter Alpha 3. It was just getting weird, and it is a cool game though. Street Fighter Alpha 3 is definitely a game. It's like they took a chance on it, right? Um, but it was just a weird game. I remember not really people who liked it in my area. But anyway, so one thing that happened from Street Fighter Alpha 3 is though, um, God, let me take a drink of water. Time. I need a water time. Is anyone still there? Anyway, so Street Fighter Alpha 3. The one thing I found out about Street Fighter Alpha 3 though is there was a guy at school, again, maybe I was in middle school at this time, I don't fucking know, so long ago, right? But not quite middle school now. Anyway, whatever the case, no, it wasn't middle school, so now that around that time, there goes my fucking computer. Did you show up? So I met a guy who also played Street Fighter, and they introduced me to this guy, and so me and him started playing a little bit, and this is around the time that CVS 1 was coming out, right? And this guy had actually played Street Fighter. And he's like, yeah, dude, you ever go to this arcade called Pinball Pizza or whatever? And he was like, yeah, they have tournaments there, and you're allowed to enter tournaments. He's like, dude, you're like really good at video games. He's like, you should enter. And I was like, okay. I was like, at that time, again, I didn't know that people could enter tournaments, right? I was like, wow, I can enter a tournament and it's like not that far away. He's like, yeah, dude, right? So, and then this gets into the story of, so CVS 1. And at the time, I had also liked King of Fighters. And that's where the name Final Showdown came from, because Kyo does that super, the Final Showdown. He throws the fireball. He runs through the fireball. He's on fire. He beats the shit out of you. I was like, wow, that super is so cool. And I was like, I guess I got to think of a name if I'm going to go to a tournament someday. So I'm like, I'm going to have my name be Final Showdown. So that's where that name came from. And we went to the CVS tournament, and it was actually a big one, right? For the area, for the time, right? And there are all these people kind of like from the Midwest, right? And they had been going to tournaments, across the country. A guy had just gotten fifth at ECC. And there was the guy that was considered second best in the Midwest at the time there, best in Michigan, And God, I remember, so I got there before the tournament, and I don't know who the fuck anyone is, right? And there's also God, there was like because it was like a college town, and there was some, like, I don't know if he was like some exchange students from Korea or Japan, but I was playing casual and I was beating everyone. And I guess I don't know if it was a Japanese guy or like Korean guy or something, but I beat this guy and a guy came over to me. He's like, dude, you were the first person that has ever beat that guy or something like that, right? I think that was Boschberg who told me that. He's like, I've never seen him lose ever. And I'm like, wait, what? He's like, dude, that dude, he's like, he's never lost at the arcade before. He's like from Japan or Korea or where the fuck, I don't know. I don't know where the fuck there's. He's like, yeah, dude, I don't know if he's going to college there or whatever. He's like, dude, I've never seen him lose before. And I'm like, oh wait, so I'm gonna do good in the tournament? And he was like, well, anyway, so that guy ended up not even entering the tournament, right? But I told this story before. Entered the tournament. I ended up getting second. I ended up beating everyone pretty badly besides the dude that won. And I remember he was just doing stuff that I had like never seen before. I didn't know in CVS one that like ratio ones were good and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Because I was just playing it for fun. He had like a ratio one team and all this kind of stuff. And so he beat me. I think he beat me 3-2, 3-2, something like that. I forget what it was, 3-2, 3-2, or something like that. And everyone was like, "Wow, dude!" It's like you should enter tournaments, dude. He's like, "Dude, you're good. You need to enter tournaments." And he's like, "Man," he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah, dude." He's like, "You didn't know about level ones." He's like, "Oh man, you don't even know about like Nakaruru and all these kind of things." I'm like, "Is Nakaruru good in the game?" And they're like, "Dude, yes." They're like, "Dude," they're like, "Yes, Nakaruru and Gala." I was like, "Oh, they're good." It's like, "Dude, you got to enter this tournament, dude." It's like, "Dude, you are like good. You need to enter tournaments anyway." And I told the story. As the story goes on, I went to that tournament and I saw very quickly the community was very shady. Very early on, I got a chip on my shoulder because, again, a long time ago now, I went to that tournament. I was just destroying everyone in casual. I don't remember how big my win streak was, but eventually, I was getting sick that tournament and I was getting sicker and sicker. And eventually, Valle beat me in casual. And man, I'd started getting like, because, tournaments don't run on time. And I remember I ended up getting sick that tournament, and I remember it's like, oh God, I just ended up doing really badly. And I was just like, after doing so well in casual, and I remember just like laying down like on the Daytona machine or whatever it was, I was just totally fucked up. And I remember I had gotten home after that, and I saw all these posts about he's like, oh, look at Final Showdown, what a little baby. He just did so well in this tournament. He's beating everyone casual, and then he actually had to enter the tournament, and he saw that he did bad, so he went and he cried in the corner like a little baby. This is why our community will never be good. And I was like, dude, who the fuck are these guys? You got grown ass men talking shit about me as a kid when I got sick at the tournament, dude. So I had a chip on my shoulder very early on, and that's basically how I got into games. You know what I mean? I'm not sure if anyone else wants any like. I don't know if I should get too in depth about the Street Fighter stories, but that's how that went. So again, a lot of games, you know what I mean? Some games are more advanced now in certain ways, not as advanced in other ways. And certainly, if people have seen me play Street Fighter Alpha versus the Japanese and, those kind of crazy matches, certainly all the stuff that I am doing versus them is not exactly how we played as a kid. I was not that good back then. Do you know what I mean? But, you know what I mean? So some things are here and there, you know what I mean? Not trying to act like I was as crazy as a whatever 5, 7 year old, however the fuck old I was back then. You know what I mean? Not saying I was like doing that kind of shit, right? But how old would I have been? 5 sounds too young. I probably wasn't that young, but anyway. I know some people maybe know me about old games like a Karnow's Revenge. I did play Karnow's Revenge a little bit as a kid, or more so Fighter's History, but actually the whole Karnow's Revenge story. You know what I mean? That was basically when I had gotten a newer computer so many years and years ago when GGPO came out, and I got like a newer computer. And I guess I was like, oh, I guess I can play video games on my computer finally. Like, so I think there was, I don't remember if it's Supercade or GGPO, maybe both. And I remember it's like, oh, I remember Karnow's Revenge as a kid. Maybe I'll actually play this game. And not acting like Karnow's Revenge was played like that when I was a kid or Fighter's History, but that's just one of those things like I was just bored. And I was like, I guess the story for that is like I basically learned that game within like a couple of weeks, just randomly played it. playing it and is already like going against like the best people in that game. And then like within a month or two or something like that, there was already like a thread on like 2chan that I was like too good or something like that, and I had ruined it for everybody. You know what I mean? And I was doing video combos and real matches, and the Japanese were saying I was the best there was, and I had taken the fun out of the game and all this kind of crap. But yeah, so for a game like that, that's definitely not a game that I didn't play like that as a kid. I learned fast, I guess, or whatever. Um, Anyway, I'm not too sure how many stories to tell about, old school Street Fighter, but that's how I kind of got into games, you know what I mean? Yeah, I think this might be the last vlog for a while, unless someone actually can think of something they want to say. Anyway, the end.